He praised her commitment to non-violence since the presidential election earlier this month, in which Mr. Marcos won a disputed victory. Mr. Schultz has also said that Mrs. Aquino supports the presence of the 2 American bases in her country. A Radio Australia correspondent in Manila, Ian McIntosh, says traffic is now returning to the streets of the city, and the new government has been broadcasting appeals to Filipinos to return to their normal activities. Reuters news agency says the key issue yet to be resolved is whether Mrs. Aquino will have the full backing of the military, led until the past few days by generals staunchly loyal to Mr. Marcos. It says it's also unclear whether Mrs. Aquino's takeover will be welcomed by Marcos-appointed provincial governors or by the communist rebels who fought Mr. Marcos for most of his years in power. Mrs. Aquino has gone on television to call for a peaceful transition of government. A spokesman for the incoming president said she'd been meeting with aides to finalize her cabinet, and Parliament was likely to meet soon to formally ratify her as president. The spokesman said many of the former Marcos supporters in the Legislative Assembly had defected, and Mrs. Aquino would have majority support. Mrs. Aquino has already named her running mate in the presidential election, Mr. Salvador Laurel, as Prime Minister designate. Now in other world news from Radio Australia.
Hours, Universal Time. You're tuned to Radio Australia in Melbourne. It's 5:10 hours.
Hello and welcome to International Report. They snatched off the streets and disappeared from view. The army and police had sweeping powers of arrest, and they were not adverse to using torture. With all this change, though, simply because of the change in the head of the state, will it make any difference? Greg Wildsmith reports.
Execution, torture, disappearances, any study of the human rights record of the Marcos regime is studded with such words. Executions refers to those students and priests, trade unionists, journalists and rural activists gunned down by the Filipino armed forces, the constabulary, the intelligence services, all for the crime of promoting opposition to Mr. Marcos and his cronies. According to a church-sponsored human rights organisation, Task Force for Detainees of the Philippines, there were 445 such executions in 1984, or salvagings, as they were known to the military. The slaughter was indiscriminate. Last September, in the city of Escalante and the north of Negros Island, soldiers fired on demonstrators demanding rice for the hungry and higher wages for plantation workers. When the gunfire stopped, more than 20 people lay dead. The then acting chief of the Defence Forces, General Ramos, defended the military, saying they acted in self-defence. General Ramos has been appointed by Cory Aquino to head the army, and there must be serious reservations about his commitment and that of another long-time Marcos supporter, Defence Minister Ramos and Enrile, to preserve human rights. Amnesty International has long catalogued the abuses of the Marcos regime. Sydney Jones is the Philippines researcher for Amnesty's London Secretariat. What can we expect now?
I think there's some things that we can count on improving. One of them is the abolishing of the preventive detention action, which has enabled the government of President Marcos to keep people in indefinite detention for extended periods of time. I think we can probably count on moves to abolish the special presidential decree-making powers that were one of the major sources of abuse under the Marcos government. I think there are other factors that remain unclear. For example, we still don't know what the total control of the military is in the provinces. We've just heard of the major armed forces reform movement in the Manila area, and we don't know what kind of control there is over some of the paramilitary forces, for example, in the provinces.
What would Amnesty International like to see?
Well, we'd like to see more control over the use of firearms. We would like to see an end to the kinds of political killings and disappearances that were characteristic of the Marcos government. We particularly would like to see much more control exerted over the civilian home defense forces, or the CHDF, which were responsible for some of the worst abuses.
Could in fact you see the CHDF being disbanded?
I believe that Mrs. Aquino has made remarks indicating that at least there were moves to disband the CHDF. The problem is that there's still a major question over what Mrs. Aquino is going to do in terms of the insurgency.
Would Amnesty be concerned if many of the members of the military and the police and the intelligence services who were perceived as being responsible for some of the human rights violations were to stay in their positions?
I think we ought to give people a chance to change allegiances, and I think if the leadership of the armed forces and the police were genuinely committed to reform, I think we would expect that they would be able to exert some kind of positive influence regardless of their past behavior.
And finally, a priest representing that most powerful institution for social cohesion in the Philippines, the Catholic Church, marks the end of the Marcos era in this way.
Let us join hands together and let us ask the good Lord to be with us in a very special way that He granted the real salvation and liberation of the Filipino people. Lord, you have been with us, the Emmanuel, God is with us. We are the pilgrim people, struggling towards your kingdom, your promises, overflowing with milk and honey. So Lord, bless our Filipino people, those who have been instrumental of this salvation. General Cruz, Minister David, and of course, our great leader, President Ramos and Enrile.
And that's it for this edition of International Report. I'm Judy Cooper.
This is indeed Radio Australia, broadcasting from our studios in Melbourne, and at this time we're calling listeners in Asia, the Pacific and Papua New Guinea on frequencies in the 16, 19 and 25 metre bands. It's 5:30 hours Universal Time.